What I want to talk about today are big global challenges related to food and nutrition security. And the first thing to begin with in setting a context is the fact that global population continues to grow. The rate of increase of population is declining, but nevertheless, between 2015 and 2050, the UN projects that we will add about 1/3 more people to the globe than we have today, so that the population by 2050 will be approaching 10 billion. The other big global challenge that sets a framework for thinking about food production and food security is environmental. We have a whole host of issues associated with environmental degradation. It remains a major threat to agriculture, and this includes things like deforestation, loss of soils, water resource inadequacies, and climate change, which is a very big threat, and I'll say quite a lot more about climate change. Let me say just a few things about food production as we know it today. The FAO projects that food demand will increase by about 70% between now and 2050. That is, food demand will actually grow about twice as fast as population will. And the reason is a shifting of diets more and more towards meat heavy diets. And that means that we grow corn and soybeans to feed the animals, to provide meat for people's diets. And that's a very inefficient way to provide energy to people. Today, the world produces about 2.1 billion tons of cereals. In 2050, we estimate that will be about 3 billion tons. So we have to increase cereal production by a factor of 1.5. There's some uncertainty associated with these projections, depending on how much cereal production actually gets used for the production of things like bioenergy. And all of this is without considering the impacts of climate change. So let me talk about three dimensions of agricultural production. The first is technology. And this is a happy story, and it allows me to talk about successes over the last 50 years. The second is environmental, and this is not such a happy story. Climate change threatens agricultural production. Water resources are limiting and will be increasingly strained. And then the third pillar in agricultural production is governance. Governments set the terms. They set the rules. They provide the funding for training the next generation of scientists. They are responsible for food safety and regulation, and they govern trade and other policies which are fundamental to the agricultural economy. So I'm going to talk in order about these three things. Let me first begin with technology. So agriculture began between about 14 and 12,000 years ago, and it was the result of humans gradually selecting phenotypes of crops, of things like wheat and barley, to propagate. And it was thought that the selection was actually unconscious. And a great example of that kind of selection is what's called the non-shattering mutation in barley and in wheat. And this mutation actually prevents the ripe grain from falling off the stalk and dispersing in the ground. That makes it very easy for human collectors to collect the grain rather than picking it up off the soil. And so in that way, humans concentrated that mutation, and they did it without a conscious plan, but nevertheless they effected a significant genetic change in these cereal crops, which made them more adapted for human cultivation. We know the most about the domestication of plants and from work in the Fertile Crescent, where, as I say, agricultural agriculture really began roughly 12,000 years ago there, but it's important to point out that the domestication of plants and animals began in several places around the world almost contemporaneously. So around 10,000 years ago, we had the domestication of squash and maize in Mexico and Central America. At about the same time, the domestication of rice occurred in China. And so something must have happened to force this change in human culture more or less contemporaneously on different parts of the globe where there couldn't have been any intercommunication. And the speculation is that this was a result of humans being stressed by climate change. It was the end of the Pleistocene era, the glaciers are receding, climate became more uncertain, the year-to-year variance in climatic events became larger, and it became necessary for humans to find ways to propagate and save food sources so that they could survive through the bad years. So this is an interesting hypothesis about how climate change actually drove us to the domestication of plants, which ultimately also led to the creation of the complex civilizations that we enjoy today. In the last couple of hundred years, there have been a whole series of major technological advances in agriculture, more or less correlated with the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. So in the early and mid-1800s, there was the improvement of plows. The steel plow was introduced, which allowed the efficient breaking up of the great prairie regions and turning those into agricultural expansion, a huge expansion in the use of arable land. The foundations for genetic advances in crop improvement were laid around the turn of the 20th century after the rediscovery of Mendel's rules for genetic transmission. Food safety was enhanced during the latter part of the 19th century by Pasteur's invention of the processes of pasteurization. And finally, beginning in the late 1950s on up through the 1960s was the Green Revolution, which had a huge impact on food production. The Green Revolution was based on just a couple of simple principles, but it had an enormous effect on productivity. One was the use of dwarfing mutations in cereal grains like wheat so that a more dense population of wheat could be grown, and that increased yield tremendously. And the other was based on environmental manipulations, particularly high inputs of nitrogen fertilizer. And those two things led to a great change from the late 60s on forward until about 20 years ago, as the opportunities in those technologies began to be fully exploited. And countries like India, which were facing imminent starvation in the early 1960s, became self-sufficient in food production as a result of this simple suite of innovations. It's a huge success story, one of the, I think, most important scientific achievements of the 20th century. So this little graph just shows changes in yield increases for corn, for maize, as a based on different technologies of production. So you had up until about 1920 just standard open pollinated populations of maize which were selected, and then beginning in the 1920s on up until about the 50s was the double cross method of maize improvement, and that was later replaced by the single crop method. And you can see how the slopes changed and the rate of progress of improvement in yield went up enormously. So this is another wonderful success story in terms of agricultural production. Now this progress is all the result of science, technology, and innovation, STI in this slide. It's played a major role, STI has played a major role in feeding people, in assuring that there are abundant food supply, and more recently, it played a significant role in achieving what were called the Millennium Development Goals. The UN had elaborated these 15 Millennium Development Goals, which were, in this hemisphere, were all essentially achieved. And they began with food availability, food security, reducing infant mortality rates. All of these things have been achieved, and even exceeding the targets set by the Millennium Development Goals here in the Caribbean and Latin America. So the last 15 or 20 years have been a great success story for science as applied to improving human welfare. So now let me just look at the sort of recent growth of biotechnology as another kind of success story, which tells us a lot about the great rate of innovation in science that is a result of public investments that have been made over the years in all of our countries. And economic studies show that there is about a 20-fold return on every dollar invested in agricultural research over the long term. So it's a huge return, a very successful investment. So with regard to biotechnology, I've just set out these timelines, beginning with the discovery of the structure of DNA in 1970, to the discovery of restriction enzymes, which gave us the fundamental tool to do molecular cloning. The 73, the first successful efforts to clone genes into bacterial plasmids, the beginnings of recombinant DNA technology. In 1980, the PCR method is invented. Plant transformation also comes along in the early 1980s, allowing us to put foreign genes into plant genomes using agrobacterium. Then there are some interesting applications that came along shortly after. One was the ice minus bacterium that was developed in Berkeley, and which was going to help protect some crops from the threat of freezing. 1990, the Human Genome Project was initiated. It was estimated at the time, human genome has 3 billion base pairs. The back of the envelope estimate was that it would cost $1 per base pair to do the Human Genome Project. That is $3 billion. Today, you can do a human genome for $500 to $1,000. So the pace of technological change has been tremendous. Rapid innovations in DNA sequencing. Other examples were the Flavor Saver tomato, which was developed in the early 1990s. Turned out to be one of the few efforts to develop a product based on recombinant DNA technology, which gave an advantage to the consumer, and it wasn't successful. But all of the subsequent innovations up until about 5 years or 10 years ago have been solely aimed at the production end. That is, they provide things like disease resistance, and that enhances production, herbicide resistance, but it has no perceived benefit to the consumer. So all of the subsequent advantages on which the GMO-based technologies in agriculture based really benefit the producer, but not the consumer. 2000, the Arabidopsis genome was sequenced. We've got a whole plant genome. Arabidopsis has a small genome. It actually was published before the human genome sequence was completed in 2001. And then this rapid DNA sequencing technologies evolved very fast. Now, those of you who work in plant or animal breeding know that learning what a gene is still not sufficient. You have to know how the gene is connected to the phenotype, because it's the phenotype which is the manifestation of the organism in the environment. And that's a black box in most cases. But we've made huge advances in connecting genes to phenotypes, including first the development of express sequence tags, then later microarray analysis, metabolomics, which actually allows us to look at the flux through metabolic pathways and identify particular steps and pathways that seem to be controlling flux. Genetic markers, which are now used to increase the efficiency of conventional breeding. Association mapping, comparative analyses of whole genome sequences to identify candidate genes based on an evolutionary approach. So there's just this wonderful elaboration of technologies and innovations that has taken place over the last quarter century, which has made it possible to do things that we could have only dreamed about before. Now, technological advance is the side of the coin that we depend on to meet the other challenges, the challenges of population growth and increased demands for meat products on the one hand, and the challenges of environmental degradation on the other. So this is the positive, the success story side. So let me, just a few things, a few facts that I think are worth repeating. More than 85% of all biotech and GM crops are currently planted in the Americas. And these have provided substantial benefits in the terms of reduced usage of pesticides, reduced tillage demands, less soil erosion, and some reductions in greenhouse gas production. So on balance, GM crops have provided significant advantages from an environmental point of view. The other point is that the Americas is probably the region of the world that has the most potential for future growth in food production. So what does the future look like? Well, first, I've tried to argue that the pace of technology growth has been phenomenal, particularly as it relates to things like the biotechnologies. And there's every reason to expect a continued flow of new applications. But there are also challenges, as with any new technology also poses questions. And some of these are, what's the role of public investment? Public investment has been crucial to getting to where we are now. What will its role be in the future? Intellectual property, IP. Who owns new applications? It's an economic truism that most of the economic value is captured in the final steps of the commercialization process. So the fundamental discoveries are not easy to monetize. They don't have that kind of economic value. It's the last couple of steps in the process that brings in the private sector, where there is an opportunity to gain a profit. Who pays for all this? Are there losers? Do small-scale farmers end up at a disadvantage in this kind of system compared to industrialized agriculture as is practiced in places like the Midwest of the United States? And how can these things be addressed in a way that fosters equity in the world while meeting our needs for food supply? And what does this mean for a region like the Caribbean, where there is not much industrialized agriculture and where you are at a comparative disadvantage in many areas of agricultural production? Okay, now let me turn to the next pillar, which is the environment, and focus on it for a bit, because agriculture is absolutely dependent upon the environment. You can't grow plants and animals, at least at the scale that we need to feed the globe, without having a favorable environment. So what are the elements? Water. Water is a limiting resource, and I'll come back to water as I go along. Climate. Most farming is absolutely dependent on the weather. Farmers are always interested in the weather because their livelihood depends on whether it rains or not. Irrigation and water management are crucial technologies that need more development and need to become more efficient. In some cases, there are opportunities associated with greenhouse production, but these are capital intensive and not generalized to the broad needs that we have. Soil resources, you can't grow plants without soil, or not outside of hydroponics, you can't. And the greatest environmental disaster in the Americas, at least, of the 20th century was the Dust Bowl in the Midwestern United States. And many people died as a result of the intense dust storms, which clogged their lungs, caused them to have respiratory diseases, and actually died. It was a high source of mortality. What drove the Dust Bowl? World War I because of the destruction in Europe and the collapse of European agriculture, drove a great demand for grain crops from the United States. That induced high prices, and it caused agriculture and farmers to move into marginal lands west of the 100th meridian, where rainfall was not secured. It happens coincidentally that this was a period when there was high rainfall west of the 100th meridian, so it looked like a successful gambit. So many small farmers moved to the region that later became the Dust Bowl. Then after about 1924, after the war, prices began to fall, and at the same time, the climate began to change, so that the rainfall went into a pattern of low rainfall, which was a normal historical fluctuation. As a result of that, all of these farms, which were the sod, which had held the soil, had been plowed up for agriculture, became dry and got mobilized by windstorms, and it drove people off the land. It was one of the contributing factors of the Great Depression in America, and it caused people to migrate to the west, to California, or to the cities. So this soil is an absolutely crucial thing. There are other things that destroy soil: compaction, mismanagement of soil resources, overuse of nitrogen fertilizers are all issues. Okay, water. So poor water quality and inefficient water management are among the greatest environmental challenges for the Americas. Now, despite this, the Americas are very rich in water resources. The Amazon basin has tremendous water resources. Parts of the United States have large water resources. So we're lucky that we have a very ample potential in that resource base, but we've been mismanaging it for a long time. And there's a lot of opportunity for continued progress in irrigation efficiency, and it's going to be essential to be able to do that in order to manage our water supplies in a way that will meet the agricultural needs of 2050. Another thing that happens to our water supplies is contamination. So we have all kinds of contaminated materials that now flow into our streams and lakes, and these include things like pathogens, fertilizers, pesticides, decomposed plant material, and so forth. And finally, this increases turbidity in our streams and lakes, which affects fish life, but it also means that things like our dams silt up much faster than they otherwise would, and their lifespan is therefore reduced. And dams are a very important form of water storage, especially in the arid West where I live. So agriculture is also a major contributor to climate change, and I want to elaborate on this a bit. But one thing I'd like to say about climate change at the start is that it's the extreme events that get you. It's not the mean, it's the extreme events. And 100-year events are going to become 10-year events. So extreme events, extreme climatic events are going to be more frequent, like the floods in Houston, where there was 50 inches of rain in a day, or the hurricane events that that we've recently witnessed in the form of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, those extreme events are going to be more frequent, and they are disruptive to agriculture and cause large agricultural losses. All right, well, what does agriculture contribute to climate change? Turns out quite a lot. The non-carbon forms of greenhouse gases are largely put in the atmosphere by agriculture. Animal agriculture is a big contributor of methane to the atmosphere, along with rice paddy cultivation, biomass burning, manure management. So agriculture by itself contributes about 12% of all of the greenhouse gases that are put in the atmosphere on an annual basis. If we add in forestry, and some forestry is done to clear land for agriculture, it goes to 24%. So agriculture plus forestry account for 24% of the greenhouse gases put into the atmosphere. So there are opportunities to try and reduce this load as we try and stave off the threats of climate change. Early on, when people began to worry about climate change and CO2 increases in the atmosphere, plant scientists said, well, that might be good for agriculture because enhanced CO2 should enhance plant growth, because plants perform photosynthesis and turn that into energy by taking a molecule of CO2 and building a carbohydrate through the ribulose 1,5-bisphosphate, which was the enzyme which does that. But it turns out that that's not the case, and these are the results of empirical experiments, and it's partly because of ozone also going up with greenhouse gases. So you see that after about 1 to 1.5 degree warming, you have a fall off in yield for virtually all major crops, and some of them are really pretty extreme, like India wheat, which has a fall off at 4 degrees compared to 0 of about 3-fold. So crop yield can be expected to decline after we approach something like 2 degrees centigrade in global warming. Now, this just shows different scenarios for global warming. This is a low emission scenario, this is a middle one, and this is the high emission scenario. Let's see if I can do it right here. Well, anyway, even under the low emission scenario, we're going to have a much warmer world by 2100. The high emission scenario, which is the trajectory that my government seems to want to put us on, will lead to a world that is not sustainable in any form. Impacts of climate change on water resources are going to be substantial. Soil moisture will go down. Some areas like the US West and Southwest, where I come from, the western prairies in Canada, and central and northern Mexico will be badly impacted. The US Great Plains, which is a hugely productive area, is one of 4 global future vulnerability hotspots for water availability under a excess of 2 degree centigrade scenario. Global impacts on water. So climate change is projected to reduce renewable surface water and groundwater resources significantly in most dry subtropical regions. That includes the Caribbean. Each degree warming is expected to decrease renewable water resources by at least 20% for an additional 7% of the global population. What are the predicted impacts on North American agricultural production? Well, crop losses attributed to climate change related events such as drought and extreme heat are going to be substantially greater. We are already observing more intense storms across North America, which reduce agricultural production through damage. The yields of major crops in North America will decline modestly by mid-century and substantially by the end of the century. And this is because of an exceedance of temperature thresholds and water availability. Some specific impacts, for example, there would be a substantial reduction in corn, soy, and cotton yields by 2020. That's 2 years away. And declines would range from 30 to 80% by the end of the century. Central North America, once again, is identified as among the world's regions of highest risk for heat stress by the turn of the century. So it's not a very pretty picture, and we have to figure out how to manage it. And hopefully our rate of technological progress will help offset some of this, or maybe all of it if we're very fortunate. So what are some of the general considerations? First, the terrestrial ecosystems provide a variety of services for agricultural production, including nutrient cycling, waste production, seed dispersal. These are complex systems. Interactions between carbon, ozone, mean temperature rise, temperature extremes, reduced water availability, and other changes to the nitrogen cycle are likely. Disruptions in these systems will have unpredictable and largely negative outcomes. The adaptive capacity is projected to be exceeded if temperatures increase by 3 degrees centigrade over the baseline, and especially in regions close to the equator. Climate-related risks interact with existing environmental stressors so that the losses may be greater than linear. These interactions compound risks to agricultural production and food security. They'll induce things like price volatility caused by extreme climate events, and will enhance investment uncertainty, which makes it harder to invest in agriculture. And finally, the impacts, as always, are largest for the poor. Are there ways that we can adapt to climate change? There's some things we can try and do to adapt. Response options depend on accurate predictions of future impacts. That means more science, better predictive science. We can breed heat-tolerant crops, but this takes time and investment capital. It doesn't happen overnight. Anybody here who works in plant breeding knows it's a slow process. We can try and control things like development in areas threatened by sea level rise or flooding, which is very relevant to the Caribbean. But the real thing we can try and do is to have policies that avoid climate scenarios that impose unacceptable social and economic costs. Are there opportunities to reduce agricultural emissions? Yes, they're classified in two categories. Demand side, reducing waste and loss in food production would make a big contribution. More than 30% of food is wasted now, owing to a lot of causes: poor transportation systems, spoilage, the fact that we don't consume everything that we take. 30% of our agricultural production is lost due to wastage. Encouraging diet changes. Meat consumption, as I've already mentioned, is highly inefficient, and reduce overconsumption where it's applicable. This is on the demand side. On the supply side, management changes in land and livestock are possible. Terrestrial carbon stocks can be increased by sequestration in soils and biomass. Soils are a big sink for the sequestration of carbon if managed properly. Substitution of fossil fuels by biomass, providing certain conditions are met. I'm not so sure that the biomass as a fuel source has turned out to be that good a solution. And there's a health dimension to our agricultural production system as it has evolved. And the health dimension has several pieces. One is foodborne illness. Foodborne illness is very prevalent, and it's a source of mortality and health system costs. You know, right now we're having, for example, an episode of E. coli contamination of romaine lettuce in the United States. It was apparently produced by some farms near Yuma, Arizona, but so far they haven't been able to identify where the source of the contamination was. In other cases, they've identified sources of contamination that are associated with large feedlots that happen to be upstream from food packing facilities that are a perfect situation for creating foodborne diseases. Another issue related to this is that we treat these diseases with antibiotics, and we're facing a crisis in antibiotic resistance. The link between obesity and highly processed foods is clearly established. Over the last 20 years, the world has entered an obesity epidemic, and there are huge public health costs associated with it, as well as personal costs. People get diseases like diabetes and hypertension that they needn't have had, but it's because of poor nutrition. That adds an extra burden on the public health system, and it shortens the lives of the affected people. These highly processed, sugar-intense foods are a special threat to the urban poor, who are highly dependent on these sources of foods. I've already hit on the external cost of the public health system. So can we be better at the production of locally grown, healthy foods? And can we find ways to create incentives that make that a better option for these very high-calorie, sugar-intensive foods? And then finally, there are problems with micronutrient deficiencies, which have effects on childhood development and need to be managed effectively. Right, so now the third leg of this stool is governance, and I've tried to indicate as I go along that governance is essential. We can't address these problems without effective governance, and governance is responsible for a lot of research and education, for safety and regulation, for agricultural policies ranging from subsidies and price supports, soil conservation policies, to weather forecasting and trade policies. These are all part of the governance, the public investment in making this complicated system work. And another big piece of governance was the Paris Accords, which was a huge achievement in trying to get global agreement on carbon emissions. Unfortunately, that has now been set back by the actions of the administration in the United States, but hopefully that may change in the future. So governance is essential. What are the governance needs? One thing that is for greater cooperation, greater regional cooperation that helps address the problems of specific parts of the region through collective effort. We need to strengthen some of these institutions. In the Caribbean, CARICOM is an example. The Organization of American States could be an example, although is not at the present time. We need to do better with climate-related disaster assistance as a collective. Look at the situation in Puerto Rico, where I think that we have failed to address some of those problems. Similarly, the earthquake disaster aftermath in Haiti, both parts of the Caribbean. And we need enhanced cooperation in education and research. So those are some of the governance needs. Societal and economic impacts related to food security. The other really big threat is political instability, failed states, and conflict. This is the greatest threat to food security. When people are driven out of their homes, like is happening in Syria, become refugees, have inadequate access to everything, education to effective food supplies, and political instability and conflict induce large-scale migrations of populations, which are hard to absorb and hard to manage, and which we're seeing now in Europe and in the United States and elsewhere generate political backlashes. So in the future, where will the world's food come from? Well, there's not a whole lot of arable land left to put into cultivation. So the estimate is that only about 5% of the growth in agricultural production will come from increases in arable land. It's hoped, based on the technologies that I talked about, that higher yields and increased cropping intensity will account for about 80% in developing countries. On average, crop yield increases, though, will be only about half, about 0.8% per year, of the historical level of 1.7%. Why is that? Because much of what we're looking at historically is the benefit of the Green Revolution, and we have pretty much fully exploited those applications. Expansion of irrigation will have to play a big role. About 28% of food production resulting from efficiencies gained from the expansion of irrigation. But water withdrawals will increase to about 11% of available freshwater supplies, and pressures on renewable water resources from irrigation will remain severe. So that's where it's thought to come from. Now, I want to say a few words about that book that is on display down there. So given this picture of the future, and given the challenges of feeding the world, the academies of the Americas, there are about 22 science academies which belong to this network called the Inter-American Network of Academies of Sciences, plus 3 regional academies, the Caribbean Academy of Science, the Caribbean Scientific Union, and the Latin American Academy, all got together and developed a book of country assessments. Why country assessments? Because all policy is set by national governments in this region. There is really no supranational policy setting organization. So country assessments are tailored to send a message to country policymakers. The book, there are 232 co-authors who contributed to this, a minimum of 4 per country assessment, and they were selected in a way to balance the disciplinary areas associated with food and nutrition security. But 232 people from across the hemisphere actually contributed a substantial amount of their time and energy to writing these country assessments. The books are free as PDFs on the IANAS website, and there is a standalone summary, a separate book, which is about 50-page summary of the content of the country chapters that is also available, and it's in both Spanish and English. The major book, it's in Spanish on PDFs, but the printed publication is only in English. So this is the Caribbean chapter, for which we owe a great debt to our colleagues here in the Caribbean who contributed to this chapter. And what does it tell us? It tells us some fairly disturbing facts. One is at least 60% of the food supply in the CARICOM countries is imported from elsewhere. It's a huge dependency on imported food in the Caribbean. That means the Caribbean region is highly vulnerable to climate change and extreme climatic events, as we've seen with things like Hurricane Maria. The Caribbean is not competitive with industrial agriculture as practiced in large North and South American countries, which means you have to find other ways to be competitive and establish governmental policies that incentivize the kinds of local production that lead to healthy diets and that can be done on small-scale farms. Right now, the Caribbean is overly dependent on highly processed foods. There's a high burden of obesity and other food-related illnesses. So other key points from the Caribbean chapter: the Caribbean is challenged by natural disasters, overexploitation of natural resources, volatility in food production and prices, barriers to trade, outdated technologies, high incidence of pests and diseases, and climate change. The small, undiversified economies of the Caribbean are experiencing slow trading activity coupled with slow growth in the region. The food import bill has essentially doubled between 2000 and 2011 and is likely to double again by 2020. Oops, went the wrong way. In addition, according to the authors of the Caribbean chapter, there is a lack of an enabling environment to foster innovation in agriculture. Food prices are weak and driven by socioeconomic and political forces. There's easy access to sugary, ultra-processed, and fatty foods that has exacerbated the incidence of obesity and chronic non-communicable diseases. Now the leading cause of premature mortality in the Caribbean. A major burden of, and this is a major burden to the health systems, the national health systems of the countries of the Caribbean. So a key recommendation, and I've listed the authors of the chapters, and I just want to point out that Mark Rudevera was a wonderful person to work with, and he served as the chapter coordinator for the Caribbean chapter, and it's a very fine document, which I hope they will publish separately as a standalone document in order to talk to governments in the region. But coordinated production of value-added products using local commodities can sustain the future by minimizing the food import bill, thereby supporting the Caribbean common market and fostering food and nutrition security. So that's from our colleagues in the Caribbean. So just as a wrap-up, the food, water, climate system is a strongly interacting system with multiple feedback loops. The link between deforestation and agriculture is well established. Link between water management, irrigation, and food yields per unit arable land is clear. Expansion of pests and diseases will occur with climate change. Time lags are important and may serve to destabilize the system. These things don't happen instantaneously, but they feed back, and these complex interactions and feedback loops mean that this is a systems level problem. It's not a single factor problem. You have to manage the system in its entirety. And the role of policy in international cooperation is crucial for the Caribbean. Some additional conclusions are, we set out to ask, can the world feed 10 billion? And the answer, we think, is yes, the world can feed 10 billion people. The Americas will have to be a big part of that solution. The greatest threat to food security, as I've already argued, are failed states in conflict. And one only needs to look at Venezuela to see here's a well-endowed and otherwise wealthy country which is experiencing severe food shortages because of governance failures. Mitigation and adaptation to climate change is going to be possible. Agriculture, as I've already argued, is responsible for a significant part of greenhouse gas emissions, but there is good hope for technological innovations that can help mitigate some of this. The management of the water, energy, food nexus has a potential to conserve water and to enhance uses of renewable energy in agriculture. Right now there are conflicts between energy and water management. Energy, water storage, for example, used for electricity generation conflicts with demands for water for agricultural production. We need to manage these conflicts better. There are also conflicts between bioenergy and food production. Healthy diets and nutritional awareness. Perverse cost incentives promote the consumption of high-caloric processed foods that contribute to public health problems. We can manage perverse cost incentives. These are a matter of public policy. So I'll just end by thanking you. I thought I would show you pictures of some of the reports that my own academy has done over the years addressing issues like climate change. One of our things that we're proud of is that we style ourselves as advisors to the nation on science and technology issues, and we do that advice by putting together major reports on important issues. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.